The Return of the Indian, Chapter 3. The Way It Began. Omri was rather a private person. At least he needed to be alone quite a bit of the time. So his room, which was right up under the eaves of the house, was perfect for him. In the old house, his bedroom had been just one of the several openings off the upstairs landing, and at certain times of the day it had been like a railway station. His new room was off the beaten track. No one, in his opinion, had any reason to come up here or even pass the door. There were times now that he had it all arranged to suit himself when he forgot about how awful it was living in Havel Road, when it seemed worth almost anything to have a room like this. So again, his neighborhood now isn't good. It's scary and dangerous. His house is amazing. And so he's on the third floor of the house, kind of by himself, where his brothers won't go by his room very often. It wasn't a very large room, so his father had built a shelf high up under the skylight for him to sleep on. This was great, because he could look up at the night sky. Under his bed shelf were his desk and more shelves for his collection of old bottles, key rings, and wooden animals. The wall opposite the window was covered with his posters, a mixture of old and new, from Snoopy and an early Beatles to the police, and a funny one about a flasher who gets caught in an elevator. In pride of place were 2 large photographs of Iroquois chieftains that he'd found in magazines. Neither of these Indians looked remotely like Little Bear, but they appealed to Omri just the same. His clothes were stored on the landing so his room wasn't cluttered up with them, and that left quite a lot of space for his beanbag seats, a low table he'd sawed off his legs to half their length after seeing a photo of the Japanese room, his cassette radio, and his most recent acquisition, an old chest. He'd found this in the local market, coated with dirt and grease, and bought it for $2 after bargaining and borrowed a cart from a market man to drag it around the corner to Havel Road. He cleaned it with a scraper and some sandpaper out of the garden before hauling it up into his room. It had come up a tree, just as the man in the market had promised. The wood was oak, the hinges iron, and had a brass plate on it with the name of its first owner. Omri had hardly been able to believe it when he had removed the layers of dirt from this plate, and he read the name for the first time. So again, this is a chest, right? So it's how they used to travel without luggage. It was a chest, and when you open up the top, it's got a lot of room in there for things. But there was a metal plate on this chest, and when he cleaned it up really well, this is what it said. L. Bear. L. Bear? Little Bear? Of course it was pure coincidence, but as Omri thought, if I were superstitious. He shined the brass every week. Somehow it too made him feel closer to Little Bear. Isn't that a coincidence that that would be on the chest? The chest was not only interesting and beautiful, but useful. Omri used it for storage. There was only one thing wrong with it. It had a lock, but no key. So he piled cushions and other objects on it and pretended it was a bench. That way, nobody who happened to be prying about in his room, it still happened occasionally, mother's cleaning and brothers poking around borrowing, would realize that it contained a number of interesting and private objects. Omri knelt by the chest now and shifted to the floor a pile of cassettes, a bullworker, he was bent on developing his muscles, some cushions, and 3 copies of Mad Magazine, among other bits of junk. Then he opened the lid of the chest. It, too, was untidy, but Omri knew where to burrow. On their way down the left-hand side of in search of the folder containing his prize-winning story, Omri's fingers touched metal and paused. Then carefully he moved some other objects which were in the way and eased this metal object out. It was the small white cabinet with a mirror on its door, and a keyhole, an old-fashioned bathroom medicine cabinet, in fact, and he stood it on the Japanese table, and the door swung open. So he had kept this cabinet inside the chest for this whole year since the last story ended. Apart from a single shelf, it was quite empty as it had been when he first received it, a rather odd birthday present from Gillen over just a year ago. Omri sat back on his heels staring at it. How clearly it all came back. The cupboard, the strange little key which had been his great-grandmother's and which had mysteriously fit the commonplace lock and turned this ordinary little metal box into a time machine with a difference. Put any plastic object, an axe, an Indian teepee, a quiver of arrows into it, close the door, turn the key, and those things became real. Miniature, but real. Real leather, real cloth, real steel. Put the plastic figures of human beings or animals inside, and in the time it took to lock them in, they too became real and alive. And not just living toys, but people from another time, from their own lives, with their own personalities and needs and demands. Only it hadn't been all fun and games. As Omri had naively expected at first, Little Bear was no toy, to submit tamely to being played with, he was, for all of his tiny stature, a ferocious savage, warlike and domineering. Omri had soon realized that if any grown-ups found out about the cabinet's magic properties, they would take it and the Indian and everything else away. So Omri had had to keep it secret and look after, feed, and protect his Indian as best he could. And when Patrick had found out the secret and sneaked a Texas cowboy into the cupboard so that he too could have a little person, the trouble really started. Little Bear and Boone were natural enemies. They came close to killing each other several times. Even their respective ponies had caused endless difficulties. And then Adiel had taken the cupboard one day, and the key had fallen out of the lock and been lost, and Omri, Patrick, and the two little men had been faced with the dire possibility that the magic was dead, that these minute and helpless people would have to remain in Omri's time, his giant world, and in his care forever. It was this, the terrible fright that they all had from this notion, that had finally proved to Omri that he would have to give up his Indian friend, for friends they were by then, of a sort, and send the little people back to their own time through the magic of the cupboard. And when the key was found, that's what they all agreed on. But it was so hard to part that Boone, who was shamingly soft-hearted for a cowboy, had cried openly, and even the boy's eyes were wet. Omri seldom let himself think of those last moments, they upset him so much. When they'd reopened the cupboard door, there were two little groups. Little Bear and his wife, Omri had found for him Bright Stars, sitting on Little Bear's pony, and Boo-Hoo Boone on his white horse, only now they were plastic again. Patrick had taken Boone and put him in his pocket, and Omri had kept the Indians. He had them still. He had packed them in little wooden boxes, which he kept safe at the very bottom of the chest. Actually, it was a box within a box within a box. Each was tied tightly with string, and there was a reason for all of this. Omri had wanted to make them difficult to get at. He had always known he would be tempted to put Little Bear and Bright Stars into the cupboard again and bring them back to life. His curiosity about how they were getting on, that alone tormented him every day. They had lived in dangerous times, times of war between tribes, wars aided and encouraged by Frenchmen and Englishmen who were fighting on American soil in those far-off days. Boone's time, the time of the pioneering of Texas, 100 years before Little Bear's era, was dangerous too. And there'd been that other little man, Tommy, the British medical orderly from the First World War. Remember him? He was like a doctor. They'd magicked him to life to help when Little Bear was kicked by his horse and when Boone was dying of an arrow wound. And Tommy might be alive in Omri's world, but he'd be terribly old, about 90 by now. By putting their plastic figures into the magic cupboard and by turning the magic key, Omri had the power to recall them to life, to youth. He could snatch them from the past. The whole business nearly blew Omri's mind every time he thought about it all deeply. So he tried not to think about it too much, and to prevent his yielding to temptation, he had given his mother the key. She wore it around her neck on a chain. It was quite decorative, and people often asked her about it, and she would say, "Well, it's Omri's really, but he lends it to me." That wasn't the whole truth. Omri had pressed it on her and begged her to keep it safe for him, and safe not just from getting lost again, but safe from him, from his longing to use it again, to reactivate the magic, to bring us back as friends, to bring back the time when he had been not only, maybe not the happiest, but the most intensely, dangerously alive himself. When Omri came back downstairs with a copy of his story, his brothers were both back from school. Noticing that their parents were fairly gibbering with excitement, they were both pestering loudly to be told what had happened, and being decent, Omri's mother and father were refusing to spoil the surprise. However, the moment he entered the room, his father turned and pointed to him. "It's Omri's news," he said. "Ask him to tell you." "Well," said Gillen. "Go on," said Adiel. "Don't drive us mad." "Oh, it's just that I've won a prize," said Omri with the utmost carelessness. "Here, Mum." He handed her the folder, and she rushed out of the room with it clutched to her bosom, saying she couldn't wait another minute to read it. "A prize for what?" said Adiel cynically. "For winning a donkey race?" inquired Gillen. "Nothing much. It was only a story," said Omri. It was such a long time since he had felt this good he needed to spin it out. "What story?" asked Adiel. "What's the prize?" asked Gillen at the same time. "You know that telecom competition? There was an ad on TV. You had to write in for a leaflet from a post office." "Oh, that," said Adiel, and he went in the kitchen to get himself something to eat. But Gillen was gazing at him. He paid more attention to ads, and he had remembered a detail that Adiel had forgotten. "The prizes were money," he said slowly. "Big money." Omri grunted noncommittally, sat down on the table, and shifted Kitsa, who was still there, onto his lap. "How much?" pressed Gillen. How much did you win? You didn't win first prize. Yeah? Gillen got up. No, you have not won $300? Adiel's face appeared from the kitchen door, wearing a look of comical amazement. What? What did you say? That was the first prize in each category. I thought about entering myself. Excitement and envy were in Gillen's voice now, making it wobble up and down, and he turned back to Omri. Come on, tell us. Yeah, said Omri again. He felt his eyes on them and a great gleeful laugh rising in him, like the time Boone had done a tiny brilliant drawing during Omri's art lesson. And she thought Omri had done it somehow. This time was even more fun, though, because this time he had written it. He was sitting watching television some time later when Adiel came in quietly and sat down beside him. I've read it, he said after a while. His tone had changed completely. What, oh, my Indian story? Yeah, your Indian story. There was a pause, and then Adiel, his exam-passing brother, said very sincerely, almost humbly, That's one of the best stories I've ever read. Omri turned to him and said, Do you really like it? Whatever fights he might have had with his brothers, and he had them daily, their good opinion mattered, Adiel's especially. You know perfectly well. It's brilliant. How on earth did you dream it all up? Coming from another time and all that? It's so well worked out. I don't know. You actually had me believing it and working in all those real parts about the family. Blimey, I mean, it was terrific. Now don't take this the wrong way, but I can't quite believe you made it all up. After a pause, Omri said, What do you mean? That you think I stole it from a book? Because I didn't. It's entirely original? Omri glanced at him. Original? Yes, that's what it is. It's original. Well, congratulations anyway. I think it's fabulous. They stared at the screen for a while, and then he added, You better go and talk to Mom. She's sobbing her eyes out. Omri reluctantly went in search of his mother and found her in the conservatory at the back of the house watering her plants. Not with tears, to his great relief. She was not crying now, but she gave him a rather misty smile and said, I read your story, Omri, and it's utterly amazing. No wonder it won. You're the darkest little horse I ever knew, and I love you. She hugged him. He submitted briefly and then politely extricated himself. When's supper? Usual time. He was just turning to go when he stopped, and he looked at her again, and something was missing from her general appearance, and then he saw what it was, and his heart missed a beat. Mom, where's the key? Her hand went to her neck. Oh, I took it off this morning when I washed my hair. It's in the upstairs bathroom. Omri didn't mean to run. He couldn't help it. He had to see the key. He had to be sure it wasn't lost. He pelted up the stairs and into his parents' bathroom, and the key was there. He saw it as soon as he went in, lying on the ledge beside the basin with its silver chain coiled around it. He picked it up. It was the first time he'd held it for a year. It felt colder and lighter than he remembered. Its twisted top and complicated lock part clicked into place in some memory pattern. And something else clicked at the same time, something that had been hovering in his mind undefined since he'd read the letter. His story was original. Adiel had relieved his mind when he used that word. Even if you didn't make a story up, if you had the experience and you wrote about it, it was original, so he hadn't cheated. But the story wasn't only his. It also belonged to the little men, to Little Bear and Boone, and even to Tommy, the World War I soldier. It belonged to Patrick, too, but if Patrick had decided to deny it ever happened, then he'd given up his rights to it. And suddenly Omri realized, as he looked at the key, that his triumph wouldn't really be complete until he shared it, not just with his parents, or brother, or with the kids at school. No prize, no party could be as good as what he was thinking about now. This was his reason, his excuse to do what he'd been yearning to do ever since that moment when the cupboard door closed and transformed his friends back into plastic. Only with Little Bear and Boone could he share the secret behind the story, the most exciting part of all, that it was true. He turned and went out of the bathroom and up the remaining stairs to his attic room. Not for long, he was thinking. I won't bring him back for long. Not long enough to cause problems, just long enough to have a good talk, to find out how they are. Maybe Bright Stars has had a baby by now, a papoose. What fun if she brought it with her, although it would be almost too tiny to see. And Little Bear had made himself a chief while he was with Omri, but when he returned to his own place, his father might still be alive. Little Bear wouldn't like being an ordinary brave again. And Boone, the crying cowboy with a talent for art and a deep dislike of washing and a heavy thirst, it made Omri grin to think of him. Writing about the little men and their adventures had made them so clear in his mind that it hardly seemed necessary to do what he was going to do. What do you think? Should he bring them back? Is that a good idea? Let's see. With hands that shook, Omri probed into the depths of the chest till he found the box within the box within the box. He eased it out and closed the lid of the chest and put the boxes on top. Reverently, he untied the string on the largest box, opened it, took out the next, and repeated the operation. In the last box, carefully wrapped in cotton, was the plastic group, consisting of a brown pony, an Indian brave, and a young Indian woman in a red dress. The brave's left hand was upraised in farewell. His other arm circled the woman's waist and held the rope rein. The woman, her long brown legs hanging on each side of the pony's withers, had her hands buried in its mane. The pony's head was alertly raised, its ears almost meeting above its forelock, its feet braced. Omri felt himself quivering all over as he stood the tiny figures on his hand and stared at them. "You're coming back," he whispered, as if plastic could hear. But they wouldn't be plastic long. The cupboard was ready. Omri stood the figures not on the shelf but on the metal floor, and then he took a deep, deep breath as if he were going to dive into a cold, uncertain sea. He fitted the key into the lock, closed the door, and turned it. Let it still work, let it. He barely had time to think his thoughts before he heard the tiny, familiar sound, minute, unshod hooves drumming and pawing on the metal. Omri let his breath out in a rush. His heart was thumping and his hand shook. His fingers were still around the key, and in a second he had turned it back and opened the mirrored door, and there they were. No. No. Omri's fist clenched. There was something terribly wrong. The three figures were there all right, the details of their life, which the dull, surfaced plastic blurred, were there again. The shine on the pony's coat, the brilliance of the red dress, the warm sheen of brown, living skin, but the pony was right enough. He was prancing and stamping his feet, fretting his head against the rope. As Omri opened the door, the light fell on him, and he pricked his ears again and whickered nervously, and on his back sat Bright Stars, but she was no longer in front. Remember before she'd been in front of Little Bear? She sat back almost on the pony's haunches, and before her, but lying face down across the pony's back, was a limp, motionless form. It was Little Bear. Omri knew it, although he couldn't see his face. His head and arms hung on one side of the horse and his legs on the other. His buckskin leggings were caked with earth and blood. Omri, against his will, forced himself to peer closer and saw to his utter horror where the blood came from. There were 2 bullet holes, almost too small to see, high up on his back. Omri's mouth was wide open with shock. He looked at Bright Stars, and she was holding the pony's rein rope now, and her other hand rested on Little Bear's broad shoulders as if to steady him and keep him from sliding off the pony's back. Her face was frenzied. She had no tears in her eyes, but they were so round, Omri could see the sparks of light in the whites. Her tiny teeth were clenched in a desperate grimace. And when she saw Omri, she started like a fawn with fear, but then the fear faded from her face, and her left hand left Little Bear's back for a moment and reached itself out toward Omri. It was a gesture of frantic appeal. It said, "Help us," clearer than words. But Omri couldn't move or speak. He had no notion of how to help. He only knew that if someone didn't, Little Bear would die. Perhaps he was dead already. What could he do? Tommy's medical knowledge was not exactly up to date. How could it be? But he had been the only medical orderly, he had been a medical orderly in the First World War. But he was the best idea Omri could come up with, shocked and numbed as he was. He beckoned Bright Stars forward with one hand, and while she was guiding the pony over the top ledge of the cupboard, Omri reached back in the smallest box, and the plastic figure of the uniformed soldier was at the bottom, complete with his bag with the red cross on it. And as soon as the cupboard was empty, the horse and the riders cleared of the door, Omri slipped Tommy in and closed it again, turning the key forward and back in a second. That was all the magic took. "It'll be all right," he said to Bright Stars as she sat on the pony at the top of the chest near his face. "Tommy will fix him." And then he opened the door again eagerly and reached his hand in. The bag was there, and the uniform neatly folded, with an orderly's cap upside down on top of the pile, and the boots, and the puttees, the khaki bandages they wore around their legs in that war, neatly rolled inside the cap. But nothing else. Omri let out a cry. He slammed the cupboard door to shut out the sight of that neat little pile of clothes, empty of their owners, who no longer needed them. He knew instantly. He knew that Tommy did not live to be an old man. That one of those big German shells he had talked about, those minis, remember when he used to talk about the mini Werfers that came over them? Or perhaps some other weapon had struck him down. His snubby, cheerful face, his bravery, and his gentle hands were gone, with so many thousands of others, into the mud of those trenches. Omri had never experienced death at close hand. No one he knew well had ever died. An uncle had jumped the twig, as his father called it, last year, but in Australia. And a boy in school had been killed in a car crash, but it wasn't in Omri's class. And the realization of Tommy's death, even a whole year after he had last seen them, came as a ghastly shock. He had no one to share it with, and in any case, there was no time. And standing at his elbow was the pony, tossing his head as if impatient and heedless of anything that delayed attention to his master. Brightstar's enormous eyes were fixing on him, waiting and trusting. Later, he would think about Tommy and mourn for him later. Who would understand better than Tommy that you have to look after the wounded before mourning the dead? Rubbing his hand across his mouth, Omri looked around helplessly, and then he faced Brightstar's. How much English did she know? During her brief time with him before, he had never spoken directly to her. She had only spoken to Little Bear in their own little language, and now he must make her understand. No good, he said slowly. No help. She looked blank, although her shining hope faded a little from her face, and to make matters plain, Omri opened the cupboard again and took Tommy's plastic figure, which had come back, replacing a pitiful little pile of his uniform, and stood it before the Indian girl. She slipped from the pony's back and, holding the rope, touched the figure. And she seemed to realize at once that there was no help to be looked for in there. She turned swiftly back toward Omri. Help. You, she said in a clear, silvery voice. Omri felt sheer desperation clamp down on his heart, already heavy with sadness. He followed Brightstar's pointed finger at the lifeless-looking body across the pony. We have to lie him flat, he said at last. It was all he could think of. But it was not all he could do. He must think. He must think. He watched Brightstar struggling to lift Little Bear's heavy body off the horse. He helped as much as he dared, terrified his big, clumsy fingers would damage him, but at least he could make his hand into a kind of a platform to lower Little Bear to the ground. With his other hand, he pulled his box of tissues toward him and made a makeshift mattress out of several of them. At least they were soft and clean. And soon Little Bear was lying stretched on his stomach. Omri had been through something like this before when Little Bear had shot the cowboy Boone, and that time Tommy had been brought in to help, and he had had some tiny instruments and dressings and medicine, and crude as his old-fashioned methods were, they had worked. And Omri felt poignantly the absence of his old friend, but like one does, not just missing the person, but missing his skills, his role in one's life. And for a moment he almost felt angry with Tommy for being dead when he was so badly needed. Brightstars, who was kneeling beside Little Bear, looked up, and she said something, and it was some Indian word, and Omri shook his head. And Brightstars wrung her hands, and she pointed to the 2 bullet wounds and said in the word again, and it must be some special Indian remedy she wanted. As for the first time, Omri thought she'd probably be better off where she came from. She'd know what to do there. But at least he could clean the wounds. He knew how to do that much. He had some mouthwash, horrible stuff his mother made him gargle when he had a cold, and the bottle was on his shelf, and he jumped up and fetched it. His head was spinning. He was beginning to realize how insane it had been to start up with this business again. He was remembering the awful sense of responsibility, the anxiety, the unending succession of problems to be solved. And this time, he didn't even have Patrick to give him occasional support or good ideas. Patrick! But Patrick was useless. He didn't even believe anymore. Omri soaked a bit of his cotton from the box and the disinfectant and handed it to Brightstars, making swabbing gestures to show her what it was for. She caught on quickly, and with light, delicate strokes, she cleaned the blood off Little Bear's back. No more seemed to be coming from the holes. Omri, remembering that injured people have to be kept warm, and noticing that Brightstars was shivering, snatched up one of his gloves he had worn to school and recklessly cut the little finger off of it with some scissors. The Indian was soon inside the woolen finger, which was like a sleeping bag. Omri and Brightstars looked at each other. How? Omri said. How did it happen? Brightstar's face grew hard. Soldier, she said. Fight. Gun. In the back? Omri couldn't help asking. It was hard to imagine anyone as brave as Little Bear getting shot in the back. Fall horse, she said. Little Bear lie. Ground. Soldiers shoot. She pointed an imaginary weapon, a rifle or a musket, and gesturing once, twice, then waving her hand sharply to show the soldiers had run on, leaving Little Bear to die. You saw this? She nodded fiercely. Woman see. Soldiers come village. Braves fight. Soldiers make fire in house. Kill many. Take prisoners. Braves chase. Out far. Brightstars hide. See Little Bear fall. See soldier. She mimed him, shooting again twice. Brightstars run. Catch pony. Bring Little Bear home to village. All fire. Dead brave. Woman cry. I shut eyes. Not see. Whoosh! She made a strange noise like the rush of wind, and opening her eyes and pointed at Omri with a look of act surprise. And suddenly you were here. She nodded. Spirits bring. You save. Omri gazed at her. He had not the very faintest idea of what to do, and here she was trusting him. "Don't you think you'd be better at home in the village?" he suggested helplessly. She shook her head violently. "Village all fire, dead, dead!" She pointed everywhere on the ground. "No help. Omri only help Little Bear brother." Brother. Yes, Little Bear had swapped drops of blood with him at that last moment, making them blood brothers. He must find a way to help, but how? At that moment, Little Bear stirred and groaned. Instantly, Bright Stars crouched beside him, and Omri, whose eyes had been used to focusing on this minute detail once again, noticed suddenly that Bright Stars had become fat. Could that be? What do you think? Do you think she's really fat? Probably not, right? What do you think she is? The Little Bear was groaning and muttering, and his legs were twitching, and Omri forgot about Bright Star's new shape for a moment. What is he saying? "He say Omri, Omri," reported Bright Stars. There was more muttering, and then she said, "Now he say brother." She looked up at him with a look that he couldn't bear. He stood up. "Listen," he said hoarsely. "I have to bring help. I need something." He looked at her. "Lend me your moccasins." He pointed to her feet. Bewildered but obedient, she bent and took off the soft shoes made of beaded, embroidered animal hide and gave them to him. He wrapped them carefully in a twist of paper and put them in his pocket. "Take care of him," he said. "I'll be back." Not good, is it?